Elena Cross stood at the edge of the frozen river. Her husband's blood still dried under her fingernails, holding a toddler who wouldn't stop crying and carrying a child she could already feel kicking against her ribs. The town that had been her home for 5 years had just voted, 32 hands raised, not one lowered, to cast her out with nothing but the clothes she wore and the shame of a man they'd hanged at dawn. She had 3 days of walking before the cold would kill her, maybe two if the snow came early, and nowhere on this godforsaken frontier to go. But giving up wasn't something she knew how to do yet, and that was either going to save her or make her death a whole lot slower. If you want to see how far a person can fall before they find solid ground, or if they ever do, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story can travel. The first thing Elena learned about exile was that it didn't come with instructions. She walked north because south led back to the town. East crossed open prairie where anyone could see her, and west hit the mountains too fast. North was trees, shadow, the promise of water. It wasn't a plan. It was just the only direction that didn't feel like immediate suicide. Her daughter, Mary, clung to her back in a sling fashioned from a shawl. Her small fingers knotted into Elena's hair. The girl was 2, maybe 2.5. Elena had lost track somewhere between the trial and the rope. Mary had watched it all. She hadn't spoken since. Elena's belly hung low and heavy beneath her coat, the hem of her dress already frayed from 3 days of stumbling over roots and rocks. The baby inside her kicked at odd hours, as if protesting the journey. She tried not to think about what would happen when the child decided to come. Tried not to think about how many weeks she had left, or didn't. The woods thickened as she walked. Pine and spruce pressed in close, their branches laced with old snow that hadn't melted since October. It was early November now. The ground was hard. The sky was the color of dirty wool. She found a creek on the second day and followed it upstream, filling her canteen, rationing the jerky she'd stolen from the general store the night before they dragged Thomas out of their cabin. Stealing had felt like nothing after watching them kill him for a crime someone else committed. Stealing felt like breathing. By the third day, the jerky was gone. Mary whimpered as they walked, her breath warm against Elena's neck. Elena hummed something low and tuneless, the way Thomas used to hum when he worked the plow. It didn't comfort the girl, but it filled the silence, and silence had started to feel like a predator stalking her from the trees. On the 4th day, she found the hollow. It wasn't marked. No trail led to it. She only noticed it because the wind shifted and she smelled smoke, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Her first thought was to run. Her second thought was that running would kill her just as sure as whoever had lit that fire. She moved toward it instead, one hand steadying Mary, the other resting on the small knife she'd tucked into her boot. The blade was dull and short, meant for cutting carrots, not defending her life. But it was all she had. The hollow opened up between 2 ridges, a natural bowl of land sheltered by stone and cedar. At its center sat a cabin, low, rough-built, its chimney trailing a thin ribbon of smoke into the gray sky. A woodpile stood near the door, neatly stacked. A pair of snowshoes leaned against the wall. No horse, no wagon, no sign of a woman's touch anywhere. Elena stood at the tree line for a long time, watching. No one came out. She waited until the sun started to sink, until the cold began to bite through her coat, and Mary's whimpering turned to soft, hiccuping sobs. Then she stepped into the clearing and walked straight toward the door. She didn't knock, didn't call out. She just stood there, one hand on the latch, the other holding her daughter, her heart slamming so hard she thought it might crack a rib. The door opened before she could move. The man on the other side was tall, broad across the shoulders, his face shadowed by a week's worth of beard and a wool cap pulled low. He didn't say anything, didn't reach for a weapon, just looked at her with eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale, sharp, unreadable. "I'm not here to steal," Elena said. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended. "I just need—" "You're bleeding." She blinked. Looked down. There was blood on her boot, a dark stain spreading from the sole up toward the laces. She hadn't felt it, hadn't noticed when she'd stepped on whatever had cut through the worn leather. "I'll be fine," she said. "You won't." He stepped aside, holding the door open. Elena hesitated, every instinct screaming at her not to walk into a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere with a child on her back and another on the way. But the wind picked up, and Mary shivered, and the alternative was freezing to death in the woods. She stepped inside. The cabin was small, dim, warmer than anywhere she'd been in days. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. A table stood in the center of the room, a single chair pulled up to it. A cot sat against the far wall, a wool blanket folded at its foot. The place smelled like pine smoke and coffee and something earthy she couldn't name. The man closed the door behind her, latched it, and moved to the fire without a word. He poured water from a kettle into a basin, set it on the table, and gestured toward the chair. Sit. Elena lowered herself into it, her legs shaking with relief. She untied the sling and eased Mary down into her lap. The girl clung to her, silent and wide-eyed, staring at the stranger like he might vanish if she blinked. The man crouched in front of Elena, his hand steady as he unlaced her boot and eased it off. The cut wasn't deep, but it was dirty, full of grit and bark. He cleaned it without asking permission, his movements efficient, impersonal. When he finished, he wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth and tied it tight. "You'll need new boots," he said. "I don't have money for new boots." "Didn't ask if you did." He stood and walked to a shelf near the door, pulled down a pair of boots that looked like they'd been made for someone smaller than him. He set them beside the chair. "Try those." Elena stared at them. "Whose are they?" "No one's." "Someone wore them." "Not anymore." She didn't ask what that meant, didn't want to know. She pulled the boots on. They fit well enough, better than the ones she'd been wearing anyway. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer, just moved to the fire and poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented pot. He handed her one, kept the other for himself. Elena wrapped her hands around the warmth and drank, the bitterness cutting through the fog in her head. Mary reached for the cup, and Elena let her take a sip. The girl grimaced, then settled back against her mother's chest, her eyes already drooping. "What's your name?" the man asked. Elena hesitated. Giving her name felt dangerous, like handing over a piece of herself she couldn't get back. But lying felt worse. "Elena Cross." He nodded, as if the name meant nothing to him. Maybe it didn't. Maybe he'd been out here long enough that the world beyond the hollow had stopped mattering. "Rowan Hale," he said. "You live out here alone?" "I do." "By choice?" "Most things are." Elena didn't know what to say to that. She drank her coffee and watched him move around the cabin, stoking the fire, checking the latch on the door, his movements quiet and deliberate. He didn't look at her again, didn't ask why she was bleeding or where she'd come from or why she was wandering the woods with a child and a belly full of another. After a while, he spoke again. "You can stay tonight. There's a storm coming. You won't make it through if you're out there. I don't have anything to pay you with." "Didn't ask you to." Elena looked down at Mary, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, her small body warm and trusting. She thought about Thomas, about the town, about the 32 hands that had voted her out without a second thought. She thought about the baby kicking inside her and the miles of frozen wilderness stretching in every direction. "Just tonight," she said. Rowan didn't answer. He just pulled a second blanket from a trunk near the cot and spread it on the floor by the fire. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep here." "I can't." "You can." Elena wanted to argue, but exhaustion hit her like a fist. She stood, carried Mary to the cot, and lay down beside her daughter, pulling the blanket over them both. The mattress was thin, the pillow flat, but it felt like luxury after 4 nights on frozen ground. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind pick up outside, rattling the shutters, howling through the trees. Rowan sat by the fire, his back to her, silent and still. Elena didn't trust him, didn't know him, but for the first time since they'd hanged Thomas, she felt something other than terror. She fell asleep before she could name it. She woke to the sound of splitting wood. The cabin was empty, the fire banked low. Mary still slept beside her, curled into a tight ball beneath the blanket. Elena sat up slowly, her body aching in places she'd forgotten could ache, and looked toward the window. The storm had come. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, piling against the door, burying the clearing in white. The wind screamed like something alive, shaking the walls, clawing at the roof. Elena had seen storms before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt like the sky had decided to erase the world. The door opened and Rowan stepped inside, dragging an armload of firewood. Snow clung to his coat, his hat, his beard. He kicked the door shut behind him and dropped the wood by the hearth, shaking off the cold. "How long's it been snowing?" Elena asked. "Since midnight." "How long will it last?" 2 days? Maybe 3. Elena's chest tightened. 3 days. Could be more. She stood, her legs unsteady, and moved to the window. The world outside was a wall of white. She couldn't see the trees, couldn't see the ridges, couldn't see anything but snow and wind and the promise of being buried alive. "I need to leave," she said. "You won't make it 10 feet. I can't stay here." "You don't have a choice." She turned to face him, anger rising in her throat. "I always have a choice." Rowan looked at her, his expression flat. "Then choose to live." Elena wanted to scream at him, to tell him he didn't know what he was talking about, that staying here was just another kind of trap. But Mary stirred on the cot, and the baby kicked hard against her ribs, and she knew he was right. She sat back down, her hands shaking. Rowan moved to the fire and started cooking. Cornmeal mush, fried salt pork, coffee strong enough to strip paint. He didn't ask if she was hungry. Just set a plate in front of her, and one in front of Mary when the girl woke up. They ate in silence. The storm raged for 2 days. Elena spent the time trying to make herself useful. She swept the floor, mended a tear in Rowan's coat, helped Mary draw pictures in the ash near the hearth. Rowan chopped wood, checked the chimney, kept the fire burning. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. On the 3rd morning, the wind stopped. Elena woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural. She sat up and looked toward the window. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was pale and clear. Rowan was already awake, standing by the door, his coat on. "I'm going to check the traps," he said. "Stay inside." "I can help." "You can't." He left before she could argue. Elena watched him disappear into the snow, his figure growing smaller until the white swallowed him whole. She thought about leaving, thought about bundling Mary up and walking out into that frozen expanse and trying to find her way to where? There was nowhere to go, no town that would take her. No family left to shelter her. She'd burned every bridge the day they hanged Thomas. So she stayed. Rowan returned an hour later with 2 rabbits and a grouse. He skinned them outside, cleaned them at the creek, and cooked them over the fire. The smell filled the cabin, rich and savory, and Elena's mouth watered despite herself. They ate together, Mary gnawing on a rabbit leg, Elena savoring every bite. Rowan watched her across the table, his eyes unreadable. "You can't go back," he said. It wasn't a question. Elena set down her fork. "No." "Why?" She didn't answer right away. Didn't know how to explain what it felt like to watch the man you loved die for something he didn't do, to see a whole town turn their backs on you, to carry his child and know that child would grow up with nothing but shame and a dead man's name. "They killed my husband," she said finally. "Said he stole from the land office. He didn't. But they hanged him anyway, and then they told me to leave. Said I had 3 days to get out, or they'd do the same to me." Rowan didn't flinch, didn't offer sympathy, just nodded, like he'd expected something like that. "And you believed them?" "I didn't have a choice." "You did. You chose to run." Elena's jaw tightened. "What would you have done?" "Same thing." The honesty surprised her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his face she recognized. Grief, old and buried deep, the kind that didn't heal so much as calcify. "Why are you out here?" she asked. Rowan stood and carried his plate to the basin. "Same reason you are." He didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. Elena understood. The days blurred together after that. The snow melted slowly, revealing the hollow inch by inch. Dead grass, bare rock, the bones of the land laid bare. Elena learned how to split kindling, how to set snares, how to cook over an open fire without burning herself. Mary started talking again, small words at first. "Mama," "hungry," "cold," then full sentences. She followed Rowan around the clearing, chattering at him while he worked, and he tolerated it with a patience Elena hadn't expected. At night, Elena lay on the cot and felt the baby move inside her, strong and insistent. She tried not to think about what would happen when the child came. Tried not to imagine giving birth in this cabin with no doctor, no midwife, No one but a man who barely spoke and a toddler who still had nightmares. But the truth was, she was terrified. One night, she woke to find Rowan sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. Elena stood and moved to the fire, lowering herself into the chair across from him. The heat felt good against her skin, chasing away the cold that had settled into her bones. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Rowan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I had a wife once, and a daughter." Elena's chest tightened. "What happened?" "Fever. Took them both in the same week." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "Doesn't make it hurt less." Rowan looked at her, his eyes shadowed. "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Elena thought about Thomas, about the way he used to hold her at night, his arms strong and steady, his breath warm against her hair. She thought about the life they'd planned, the future they'd never get to have. "Do you ever stop missing them?" she asked. "No," Rowan said. "You just learn to carry it." Lena nodded. She understood that too. The next morning, she woke to a sharp, twisting pain low in her belly. At first, she thought it was nothing, just the baby shifting, pressing against some nerve or organ. But the pain came again, stronger this time, and she sat up with a gasp. Mary was still asleep beside her. Rowan was outside, chopping wood. Elena stood, one hand pressed to her stomach, and moved to the door. The pain hit again, harder, stealing her breath. She knew what it was. "Rowan?" she called, her voice shaking. He looked up from the woodpile, saw her face, and dropped the axe. He was inside in seconds, his hands on her shoulders, steady and sure. "How far apart?" he asked. "I don't know, a few minutes maybe. Can you walk?" "I think so." He guided her back to the cot, helped her lie down, and pulled the blanket over her. Mary woke and started to cry, and Rowan scooped her up, carried her to the table, and set her down with a piece of bread to keep her occupied. Then he came back to Elena, his face calm, his voice low. "I've done this before," he said. "You're going to be fine." Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this would be like every other birth, that the baby would come and everything would be fine, and she'd wake up tomorrow with a healthy child in her arms. But the pain was already worse than it had been with Mary, and the contractions were coming faster, and she could see the worry in Rowan's eyes, even if he wouldn't say it out loud. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but you're strong, stronger than you think." The pain came again, and Elena screamed. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and breathless panic. Elena had thought she remembered what labor felt like from when Mary was born, but memory was a liar. This was different, sharper, faster, meaner. The contractions rolled through her like something trying to tear her apart from the inside, and between them she could barely catch her breath. Rowan moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, boiling water, tearing cloth into strips, speaking to her in a low, steady voice that she couldn't always make out over the roaring in her ears. Mary sat in the corner by the fire, clutching a rag doll Rowan had pulled from somewhere, her eyes wide and frightened. "I need you to breathe," Rowan said, his hand on Elena's shoulder. "Slow. In through your nose, out through your mouth." "I am breathing," Elena gasped. "Not like that. Like this." He demonstrated, his chest rising and falling in a deliberate rhythm. Elena tried to match it and failed. The pain came again, stealing everything, and she arched off the cot with a sound she didn't recognize as her own. "How long?" she managed when it passed. "Not long now." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." She wanted to curse at him, to scream that she needed a real answer, a timeline, some kind of certainty. But another contraction hit, and all she could do was grip the edge of the cot and ride it out. Time stopped meaning anything. The light outside shifted from pale gray to gold to deep blue, and Elena existed only in the space between contractions, those brief, gasping moments when the pain receded enough for her to remember she was still alive. Rowan stayed beside her, his hand steady, his voice calm. He checked her pulse, wiped the sweat from her face, told her she was doing fine even when she knew she wasn't. "I can't do this," she said at one point, her voice ragged. "You don't have a choice." "I can't." "You are." She hated him for that. Hated the certainty in his voice, the way he refused to let her give up even when giving up felt like the only option left. But she kept breathing, kept pushing when he told her to push, kept fighting even when her body screamed at her to stop. Mary started crying somewhere in the background, a thin, frightened sound. Rowan glanced toward her, then back at Elena. "I need to— Don't you dare leave," Elena said through gritted teeth. "She's scared." "So am I," Rowan hesitated, then called out without taking his eyes off Elena. "Mary, come here." The girl didn't move. "Mary," he said again, firmer this time. "Come sit by your mama." Small footsteps crossed the floor. Mary climbed onto the edge of the cot, her face streaked with tears, and pressed herself against Elena's side. Elena reached for her daughter's hand and held on, squeezing hard when the next contraction came. "Mama's okay," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. Mary nodded, her grip tightening. The pain built and built, each wave stronger than the last, until Elena thought she might break apart completely. Then Rowan's voice cut through the fog, sharp and urgent. "Next one. You push, hard as you can." "I don't." "You do. Push!" The contraction came, and Elena bore down with everything she had left. She felt something shift, felt her body doing what it was supposed to do, even if it felt like dying. Rowan's hands moved with practiced confidence, guiding, supporting, catching. "Again," he said. "One more." Elena pushed. The world narrowed to a single point of white-hot agony, and then, suddenly, it was over. The pressure released all at once, and she collapsed back onto the cot, gasping. A thin, angry cry filled the cabin. Elena's vision swam. She tried to sit up and couldn't. Rowan moved quickly, his hands busy with something she couldn't see. And then he was beside her again, placing a small, squirming bundle against her chest. "It's a boy," he said quietly. Elena looked down at her son. He was red-faced and furious, his tiny fists waving, his eyes squeezed shut. He was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Is he—" Her voice broke. "Is he all right?" Rowan nodded. "He's strong, got a good set of lungs on him." The baby's cries softened to whimpers as Elena held him close, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Mary leaned in, peering at her brother with wide eyes. "Baby," she said softly. "Yeah, sweetheart," Elena whispered. "That's your brother." Rowan stepped back, giving them space, and busied himself cleaning up the mess. Elena watched him move around the cabin. This man who'd delivered her child with the same calm competence he brought to splitting wood or setting traps. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to thank someone for something like that. "Rowan," she said. He glanced over his shoulder. "Thank you." He nodded once, then went back to work. Elena closed her eyes and let herself drift, the baby warm against her chest, Mary curled beside her. She was alive. They were all alive. For now, that was enough. She woke to darkness and the sound of the baby fussing. Her whole body ached, a deep, bone-tired soreness that made even breathing feel like work. She shifted carefully, trying not to jostle the baby, and looked around the cabin. Rowan sat by the fire, mending a leather strap with a needle and thread. Mary was asleep on a pallet he'd made on the floor, wrapped in blankets. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling softly, and for a moment Elena let herself believe this was normal, that this was just life, a family, a home, safety. Then the baby started crying in earnest, and reality snapped back into focus. "He's hungry," Rowan said without looking up. Elena fumbled with her shirt, trying to get the baby positioned right. It took longer than it should have. Everything felt clumsy and uncertain, her hands shaking with fatigue. The baby latched on eventually, his cries subsiding into small, snuffling sounds. Rowan set aside his work and poured something into a cup, then brought it over to her. "Broth," he said. "You need to eat." Elena took it with her free hand and drank. It was thin and salty, but it was warm, and it settled the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She finished it quickly, and Rowan refilled it without being asked. "How long was I asleep?" she asked. "Few hours." "You should rest." "I will." But he didn't. He went back to his mending, his movements slow and methodical, and Elena realized he wasn't going to sleep until he was sure she and the baby were stable. The thought stirred something in her chest, something warm and uncomfortable that she didn't want to name. "What was her name?" she asked quietly. Rowan's hand stilled. "Who?" Your daughter." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Lily. That's a good name. She was a good kid." Elena looked down at her son, at his tiny face and dark hair, and wondered what kind of life he'd have out here. What kind of future waited for a child born in the middle of nowhere, with a dead father and a mother who had nothing to give him but survival. "I need to name him," she said. Rowan glanced over. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know. Something strong. Something that means he won't break easy." "Samuel," Rowan said after a pause, "means heard, like someone's listening, even when you think they're not." Elena tested the name in her mind, turning it over. Samuel Cross. It fit. It felt right. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah, that works." The baby, Samuel, made a small sound against her chest, and Elena smiled despite herself. It was the first time she'd smiled since Thomas died, and it felt strange, like using a muscle she'd forgotten she had. The days after Samuel's birth were harder than Elena expected. Her body was slow to heal, every movement sending sharp reminders of what it had just endured. The baby woke every few hours, crying for milk, and between feeding him and caring for Mary and trying to stay upright, Elena felt like she was drowning. Rowan took over most of the work without comment. He cooked, chopped wood, checked the traps, kept the fire going. He carved a cradle out of a split log and lined it with soft moss and rabbit fur so Samuel would have somewhere safe to sleep. He showed Mary how to fetch water from the creek without falling in, how to stack kindling, how to stay quiet when the baby was sleeping. Elena watched him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. This wasn't his burden to carry. She was the one who'd stumbled into his life, bleeding and desperate, and now she was the reason his quiet, solitary existence had been turned inside out. One morning, about a week after the birth, she found the strength to stand and walk outside. The air was cold and clean, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees, but the worst of winter had passed. Spring was coming, slow and reluctant, but coming all the same. Rowan was at the woodpile, splitting logs with steady, rhythmic strikes. He looked up when he saw her and set the axe aside. "You shouldn't be up yet," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not." Elena crossed her arms, defensive. "I can't just lie there forever." "You need another week at least." "I don't have another week. I need to start pulling my weight." Rowan studied her for a moment, then picked up the axe again. "You want to help? Stack the wood I've already split." It was a concession, and they both knew it. Elena nodded and moved to the pile of split logs, bending carefully to pick up the first piece. Her body protested immediately, a sharp ache spreading through her hips and lower back, but she ignored it. She stacked the wood slowly, methodically, until the pile was neat and the pain had settled into something she could live with. When she finished, Rowan was watching her, his expression unreadable. "What?" she asked. "You're stubborn. You say that like it's a bad thing." "It's going to get you hurt." "I've been hurt before. I'm still here." Rowan didn't answer. He just picked up another log and swung the axe, the blade biting deep into the wood with a solid thunk. Elena went back inside, her legs trembling, and lowered herself onto the cot. Mary was playing with Samuel, making faces at him while he stared up at her with unfocused eyes. The sight made Elena's chest tighten. She'd thought, when Thomas died, that her life was over, that everything worth having had been ripped away and all that was left was survival. But watching her children together, safe and warm in this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding. The weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Elena grew stronger, her body knitting itself back together, and she took on more of the daily tasks. She learned to bake bread over the fire, to cure meat, to sew torn clothes with the scraps of thread and fabric Rowan kept in a wooden box. Mary helped where she could, chattering constantly, her earlier silence forgotten. Samuel grew fat and healthy, his cries loud and demanding. Rowan stayed quiet, as always. But Elena started to notice things about him. The way he always gave Mary the best pieces of meat at dinner. The way he carved small wooden animals for her when he thought no one was watching. The way he'd pause sometimes, staring into the fire, his face shadowed with something Elena recognized as grief. One night, after the children were asleep, she sat across from him at the table and spoke. "You didn't have to take us in." Rowan looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "Didn't seem right to let you freeze." Most people would have. I'm not most people. Elena smiled faintly. No, you're not. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Then Elena said, I don't know what I'm doing here, Rowan. I don't know what happens next. No one does. That's not comforting. It's honest. Elena leaned back in her chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I can't go back. Even if they'd let me, I can't. There's nothing there for me anymore. So don't. What, just stay here, in the middle of nowhere? Why not? Because it's not mine. This is your home, not mine. Rowan set down the knife and looked at her directly. You think I care about that? You should. I don't. Elena stared at him, searching his face for some sign that he was lying or just being polite. But all she saw was the same steady, unshakable calm he'd shown since the day she stumbled into his clearing. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you doing this? Rowan was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. I told you I had a wife, a daughter. I remember, after they died, I didn't think I'd ever want anyone around again. Thought I was done with people. Done with caring. He paused, his jaw tight. But then you showed up, half dead and stubborn as hell, and I realized I wasn't as done as I thought. Elena's throat tightened. Rowan, I'm not asking you for anything, he said quickly. I'm just saying you don't have to leave. Not unless you want to. Elena didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to process the weight of what he'd just offered her. So she just nodded, and Rowan picked up the knife again, and they sat together in silence until the fire burned low. The first real sign of spring came in late March. The snow melted in earnest, turning the hollow into a muddy mess. The creek swelled with runoff, and the trees began to bud. Elena took the children outside on warm days, letting Mary run wild while Samuel dozed in a sling against her chest. Rowan started working on expanding the cabin. He didn't ask if it was all right, didn't explain why. He just started felling trees and dragging them back to the clearing, cutting them into logs, stacking them near the existing structure. Elena watched him work, and slowly she understood. He was building a second room, a place for her and the children. She didn't say anything about it, neither did he. They just kept moving forward, day by day, building something neither of them had planned but both of them needed. One afternoon in early April, Elena was washing clothes in the creek when she heard hoofbeats. Her whole body went cold. She stood slowly, water dripping from her hands, and looked toward the ridge. 3 riders were coming down the trail, moving at an easy pace. They hadn't seen her yet. Elena's first instinct was to run, to grab the children and disappear into the trees and hope the riders passed by without noticing the cabin. But Mary was inside, and Samuel was sleeping in the cradle, and there wasn't time. She ran back to the clearing, her heart pounding. Rowan was at the woodpile, and he looked up when he saw her face. What is it? Riders, she said breathlessly. 3 of them, coming this way. Rowan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He set down the axe and moved toward the cabin. Get inside. Keep the children quiet. Rowan, inside. Now. Elena obeyed, scooping up Mary and moving to the cradle where Samuel still slept. She sat on the cot, holding her daughter close, and waited. The hoofbeats grew louder. Voices drifted through the trees, low and indistinct. Then they stopped. A knock sounded at the door. Rowan opened it slowly, his body blocking the entrance. Elena couldn't see who was outside, but she heard a man's voice, rough and tired. We're looking for someone. Woman named Elena Cross. You seen her? Elena's breath caught. She pulled Mary closer, her hand over the girl's mouth. Rowan's voice was flat, emotionless. No. You sure? She's got a kid with her. Little girl, maybe 2 years old. Been missing since November. I live alone. Mind if we take a look inside? I do. There was a pause, tense and dangerous. Then the man spoke again, his tone harder. We can do this easy or we can do it hard, friend. Rowan didn't move. You can do it however you want. You're still not coming in. Elena heard the sound of someone dismounting, boots hitting the ground. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She looked around the cabin, searching for something, anything she could use as a weapon. Then another voice spoke, younger than the first. "Sheriff, hold on. Let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be." "He's hiding something." "Maybe, or maybe he just doesn't like strangers poking around his home. Can't say I blame him." The tension stretched, brittle and thin. Elena held her breath. Finally, the sheriff spoke again. "We'll be back this way in a few days. If you see her, you let us know. There's people who want to talk to her." "About what?" Rowan asked. "That's her business, not yours." Elena heard the men mount up, heard the horses start to move. The hoofbeats faded slowly, retreating back up the ridge. She stayed frozen, not daring to breathe, until the sound disappeared completely. Rowan closed the door and turned to face her. "They're gone," he said. Elena let go of Mary and stood, her legs shaking. "Why were they looking for me?" "Don't know. But they'll be back. I need to leave. I'm putting you in danger. You're not going anywhere." "Rowan, I said no." His voice was firm, final. "You leave now. They'll find you before nightfall. You stay. We figure this out together." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he didn't owe her anything, that this wasn't his fight. But the truth was, she was terrified. And Rowan was the only thing standing between her and whatever those men wanted. So she nodded and Rowan went back outside, and Elena sat on the cot with her children and tried to stop shaking. The days after the riders came were tense. Rowan moved through the clearing like a man waiting for a fight, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He kept the rifle close, even when he was just chopping wood or checking the traps. Elena stayed inside as much as possible, keeping the children quiet, watching the ridge for any sign of movement. But the riders didn't come back. Not that day, or the next, or the one after that. Slowly, the tension began to ease. Life settled back into its rhythm. Rowan finished framing the second room and started laying the floorboards. Elena planted a small garden near the cabin, turning over the soil with a spade Rowan had made from a flat stone and a sturdy branch. Mary helped, digging holes with her hands and dropping in seeds with solemn concentration. Samuel grew, his eyes focusing, his hands reaching for things. He smiled when Mary sang to him, and he cried when he was hungry, and Elena loved him so fiercely it scared her. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned gold and pink, Elena stood outside the cabin and looked around the hollow. The place that had seemed so foreign and hostile when she first arrived now felt like something else. Not home exactly. Not yet. But close. Rowan came up beside her, his arms full of firewood. He glanced at her, then at the horizon. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked. Elena shook her head. "No, I'm thinking about staying." Rowan nodded slowly. "Good." They stood together in silence, watching the light fade, and Elena realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if the riders would come back, or if winter would be as brutal as the last one, or if this fragile thing she and Rowan were building would hold, but she knew she wasn't alone. And that was enough. Spring came in fits and starts, warm days followed by cold nights, the land unable to make up its mind about whether winter was truly done. Elena worked the garden every morning, her hands deep in the soil, coaxing life from the earth. The seeds Rowan had stored in glass jars, beans, squash, turnips, went into neat rows she'd measured out with string and stakes. Mary followed her everywhere, asking questions Elena didn't always have answers to. "Why do we put them in the ground, Mama? So they can grow." "But why in the ground?" "Because that's where the food is. The dirt feeds them." "Like milk feeds Samuel?" Elena smiled, despite the ache in her back. "Yeah, like that." Samuel was 4 months old now, fat and healthy, his eyes bright and curious. He'd started reaching for things, Elena's hair, the wooden animals Rowan carved, anything that caught his attention. He laughed when Mary made faces at him, a deep belly sound that seemed too big for such a small body. Rowan finished the second room in early May. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a door, a window facing east, but it was separate, private, a space that belonged to Elena and the children. He'd built a bed frame from split logs and stuffed a mattress with dried grass and moss. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the cot, and Elena was grateful. "You didn't have to do all this," she said the day he showed it to her. Rowan shrugged. "Needed doing. Still, Thank you. He nodded and went back to his work, and Elena moved their things into the new room, what little they had. A change of clothes for each of them. The blankets. Samuel's cradle. It didn't take long. That night, lying in the new bed with Mary curled beside her, and Samuel asleep in the cradle, Elena stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas. She hadn't let herself think about him much since the birth. It hurt too much, felt too much like picking at a wound that hadn't healed. But here, in the quiet dark, his memory crept in. She wondered what he'd think of this place, of Rowan, of the life she'd built out of the wreckage of the one they'd planned together. Would he understand? Would he be angry that she'd moved on, that she'd let another man into her life? Even if it wasn't like that, even if Rowan had never touched her or looked at her the way Thomas used to? She didn't know. And the not knowing hurt worse than anything else. The garden grew. Pale green shoots pushed through the soil, reaching toward the sun. Elena weeded and watered, her hands calloused and strong. Rowan expanded the clearing, felling more trees, dragging stumps, turning wild land into something they could use. He built a chicken coop from scrap wood and wire, though they didn't have chickens yet. He dug a root cellar into the hillside and lined it with stone. Planning on staying a while? Elena asked one afternoon, watching him work. Rowan paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. Why wouldn't I? I don't know. Seems like a lot of work for a man who lived alone for so long. Things change. Elena didn't push. She'd learned that Rowan said exactly as much as he meant to say, and not a word more. If he wanted to explain, he would. If he didn't, no amount of asking would make a difference. Mary turned 3 in June, though Elena couldn't be sure of the exact day. They celebrated anyway, because it seemed important to mark the time, to acknowledge that the girl had survived another year in a world that didn't make survival easy. Rowan carved her a small horse from a piece of cedar, its legs sturdy, its mane etched in careful detail. Mary carried it everywhere, talking to it like it was real, naming it Thunder because she liked the sound of the word. Samuel started sitting up on his own. He'd topple over after a few seconds, his balance not quite there yet, but he kept trying, his face scrunched in concentration. Elena watched him, amazed at how quickly he was changing, how every day brought something new. One morning in late June, Rowan came back from checking the traps with a deer slung over his shoulders. It was a young buck, not fully grown, but big enough to feed them for weeks. He dressed it outside, working quickly and efficiently, and Elena helped him cut the meat into portions for smoking and salting. We'll need more salt before winter, he said, his hands bloody to the wrists. Where do we get salt out here? Trading post, about 2 days' ride south. Elena looked up sharply. You're leaving? We're leaving, all of us. Rowan, I can't. You can. We need supplies, and I'm not leaving you here alone. Not after those riders came through. Elena wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. They couldn't live on what the land gave them forever. They needed flour, salt, coffee, cloth, things they couldn't make or grow. And Rowan was right about the riders, too. She didn't know if they'd come back, but she wasn't willing to bet her children's safety on it. When? She asked. 2 weeks, soon as the meat's cured. They spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Rowan packed the smoked venison into canvas bags and loaded them onto a travois he'd built from saplings and rope. Elena gathered the furs they'd cured over the winter, rabbit, fox, a single wolf pelt Rowan had taken in February. They were worth something, enough to trade for what they needed. The morning they left, the sky was clear and bright, the air warm but not yet oppressive. Rowan rigged the travois to a sturdy pack horse he kept hobbled near the cabin, a gray mare with a patient disposition and a tendency to ignore anything that wasn't an immediate threat. Elena carried Samuel in the sling, and Mary rode on Rowan's shoulders, chattering about everything she saw. The journey south was slow. The trail was rough, barely more than a deer path in places, and they had to stop frequently to rest the horse and let Mary stretch her legs. Samuel fussed in the heat, his face red and sweaty, and Elena did her best to keep him cool and fed. They camped the first night beside a stream, the water cold and clear. Rowan built a small fire and cooked beans and salt pork in a battered pot. Mary fell asleep almost immediately after eating, her head pillowed on Elena's lap. Samuel nursed and dozed, his small hand curled around Elena's finger. Rowan sat across the fire, his face shadowed, his eyes on the darkness beyond the light. You ever been to this trading post before? Elena asked. A few times. What's it like? Rough. People don't ask questions, and you don't answer them. Elena nodded. That sounded about right for a place this far from anything resembling civilization. Will they recognize me? She asked quietly. Rowan looked at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe. If they do, we leave. No questions, no explanations, we just go. What if they don't let us? They will. The certainty in his voice should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Elena had learned the hard way that certainty didn't mean much when the world decided to turn on you. They reached the trading post late the next afternoon. It sat at the edge of a wide valley, a cluster of rough buildings surrounded by a palisade fence. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the sound of voices drifted on the wind, shouting, laughing, the clang of metal on metal. Rowan stopped at the gate, and a man stepped out of the guardhouse. He was older, his face weathered and scarred, a rifle slung over his shoulder. State your business, he said. Trading, Rowan said. Got furs and meat. Need supplies. The guard looked them over. Rowan, Elena, the children, the loaded travois. His eyes lingered on Elena for a moment too long, and she felt her stomach tighten. Go on in, he said finally, but keep the peace. We don't tolerate trouble here. Understood, Rowan said. They led the horse through the gate and into the compound. The place was bigger than Elena had expected, more crowded. Men and women moved between the buildings, carrying goods, haggling over prices, loading wagons. Children ran wild, their faces dirty, their clothes patched and worn. It reminded Elena of the town she'd left, and the memory made her chest ache. Rowan led them to a long, low building with a sign that read, Goods and Trade, nailed above the door. He tied the horse to a post and helped Elena down, then lifted Mary off his shoulders. Stay close, he said quietly. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you to. Elena nodded and followed him inside. The interior was dim and cramped, shelves packed with everything from flour and sugar to tools and fabric. The smell was overwhelming, tobacco, leather, something sharp and chemical Elena couldn't name. A man stood behind a counter at the back, his arms crossed, his expression bored. Help you? He asked. Rowan stepped forward. Need to trade. Got venison and furs. The man's eyes flicked to the travois outside, then back to Rowan. Let's see what you've got. They unloaded the goods onto the counter, and the man inspected them with practiced efficiency. He poked at the venison, sniffed it, held the furs up to the light. Finally, he nodded. Fair quality. I'll give you $20 worth of credit. 30, Rowan said. 25, and that's generous. 30, or I take it somewhere else. The man laughed, a short, humorless sound. There is nowhere else, friend. Rowan didn't blink. Then you'll lose the sale. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then the man sighed and waved a hand. Fine, 30, but you're robbing me blind. Appreciate it, Rowan said, his tone flat. They spent the next hour gathering supplies. Salt, flour, coffee, sugar, a bolt of sturdy cloth Elena could use to make clothes for the children. Rowan picked up a box of ammunition for the rifle and a new knife to replace the one he'd broken a month ago. When they were finished, they'd used up most of the credit, but they had what they needed. Elena was carrying a sack of flour toward the door when she heard a voice behind her. Elena Cross. I'll be damned. She froze. The sack slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a soft thud. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. A man stood near the counter, his hat pushed back, his face familiar in a way that made her stomach drop. She knew him, Jacob Pruitt. He'd lived in the town, worked at the sawmill, been friendly with Thomas. Jacob, she said carefully. His eyes were wide, his expression caught between shock and something else Elena couldn't read. They said you were dead. Said you froze to death out in the wild. I didn't. I can see that. He glanced at the children, at Rowan standing a few feet away. Who's this? A friend, Elena said quickly. Jacob's gaze shifted to Rowan, assessing. Hell of a friend, to take in a woman with 2 kids. Rowan didn't respond. He just stood there, his hand resting on the knife at his belt, his face cold and unreadable. Jacob looked back at Elena. You need to come back. There's things you need to know. I'm not going back. Elena, I said no. Jacob stepped closer, his voice dropping. Your husband didn't do what they said. The land office records. They found them. Someone had altered the books, made it look like Thomas stole money and land deeds, but it wasn't him. It was Walter Finch. The name hit Elena like a fist. Walter Finch, the land office clerk, the man who'd testified against Thomas at the trial, who'd stood up in front of the whole town and said he'd seen Thomas with the stolen records. That doesn't make sense, Elena said, her voice shaking. Walter was the one who... He lied, covered his own tracks by blaming Thomas. They arrested him 2 weeks ago. He confessed to everything. Elena's knees went weak. She reached for the counter to steady herself, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Thomas had been innocent. She'd known it, had believed it with everything she had. But hearing someone else say it, hearing that the truth had finally come out, felt like being gutted. They hanged him, she said hoarsely. They killed him for something he didn't do. And now you're telling me it's all fixed? That they found the real thief and everything's fine? Jacob looked down, his jaw tight. I know, it's not right. It's not fair, but the town, they want to make it right with you. They want you to come back. Make it right? Elena's voice rose, sharp and bitter. How do they make it right, Jacob? How do they bring Thomas back? They can't. But they can clear his name, give you his land back, compensation. They're talking about... I don't care what they're talking about. Elena's hands were shaking, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. They took everything from me. They stood there and watched him die, and then they threw me out like I was garbage. And now they want me to come back? To forgive them? Jacob spread his hands. I'm just telling you what I know. What you do with it is up to you. Elena looked at Rowan. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, waiting. She turned back to Jacob. Tell them I'm dead, she said quietly. Tell them whatever you want, but I'm not coming back. Jacob opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded slowly. All right, if that's what you want. It is. He tipped his hat to her, glanced once more at Rowan, and walked out. Elena stood there, her whole body trembling, and tried to breathe. Rowan moved to her side, his hand light on her shoulder. You all right? He asked quietly. No, she said, but I will be. They finished loading the supplies and left the trading post without another word. The ride back to the hollow was silent, the weight of what Jacob had said pressing down on Elena like a physical thing. Mary dozed on Rowan's shoulders. Samuel slept against Elena's chest. The world moved around them, indifferent and unchanged. That night, after the children were asleep, Elena sat outside the cabin and stared at the stars. Rowan came out after a while and sat beside her, a cup of coffee in his hands. You thinking about going back? He asked. Elena shook her head. No, there's nothing there for me. They might see it differently. I don't care how they see it. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Thomas was innocent. I know. Does it change anything? Elena thought about that. Thought about the way Thomas had looked at her the night before they took him, his hands steady on her face, his voice low and calm. Whatever happens, you keep going. You hear me? You keep going. She'd kept going. She'd done exactly what he'd asked, and it had brought her here, to this hollow, this man, this life she hadn't chosen, but had built anyway. No, she said finally. It doesn't change anything. He's still gone. They still killed him. And I'm still here. Rowan nodded and sipped his coffee. They sat together in the darkness, the fire crackling softly inside the cabin, and Elena let herself feel the grief she'd been holding back for months. She cried quietly, her shoulders shaking, and Rowan didn't say anything. He just stayed beside her, solid and unmoving until the tears stopped and the night grew cold. The summer passed in a blur of work and heat. The garden flourished, the plants growing tall and green, heavy with vegetables. Elena harvested beans and squash, turnips and greens, preserving what they couldn't eat fresh. Rowan hunted and fished, bringing back deer and rabbit and the occasional wild turkey. They smoked meat, dried berries, stored everything they could for the winter they knew was coming. Mary grew stronger, more confident. She helped with small tasks, fetching water, gathering kindling, feeding the chickens Rowan had traded for at the post. She was fearless in a way that terrified Elena, climbing trees and wading into the creek without hesitation, her laughter ringing through the hollow. Samuel started crawling, pulling himself across the floor with determination that made Elena's chest ache. He was loud and demanding, always wanting to be held, always reaching for things he couldn't have. But he was healthy, and that was more than Elena had dared hope for. Rowan built a second coop and a small barn for the horse. He dug a well so they wouldn't have to haul water from the creek every day. He worked from dawn until dusk, his hands blistered and calloused, his body lean and hard from the labor. Elena watched him and wondered what he thought about. If he ever regretted letting her stay. If he ever wished he'd turned her away that first night, sent her back into the woods to freeze. But she didn't ask. Asking felt dangerous, like it might shatter the fragile balance they'd found. One evening in late August, a storm rolled in fast and violent. The sky turned black, the wind howling through the trees, and rain came down in sheets so thick Elena couldn't see the barn from the cabin door. Thunder cracked overhead, loud enough to shake the walls, and lightning split the sky. Mary screamed and ran to Elena, burying her face in her mother's skirt. Samuel wailed from the cradle. Elena scooped him up and held both children close, her heart pounding. Rowan stood at the window watching the storm, his face grim. "How bad is it?" Elena asked, raising her voice over the noise. "Bad enough. If the creek floods, we'll lose the garden." "Can we do anything?" "No, just wait it out." The storm raged for hours. The rain didn't let up, and the wind tore branches from the trees, hurling them across the clearing. Elena sat on the bed with the children, singing softly to keep them calm, though her own fear was a living thing clawing at her ribs. Finally, around midnight, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed to a drizzle, the wind died down, and the thunder faded into the distance. Rowan pulled on his coat and went outside to check the damage. Elena waited, her nerves stretched tight until he came back. "Garden's flooded," he said, water dripping from his hair. "Lost about half the crops. The rest might survive if the water drains fast enough." Elena closed her eyes, her chest tight. Half the crops. That was half their food for the winter, gone in a single night. "We'll manage," Rowan said, reading her expression. "We've got the meat, the root cellar. We'll hunt more if we need to." "What if it's not enough?" "Then we make it enough." Elena wanted to scream at him, to tell him that making it enough wasn't always possible, that sometimes the world took everything no matter how hard you fought. But she didn't. She just nodded and turned back to the children because there was nothing else to do. The next morning, they surveyed the damage. The garden was a muddy mess, half the plants uprooted or drowned. The chicken coop had lost part of its roof. A tree had fallen near the barn, missing the structure by inches. It could have been worse, but it was bad enough. They spent the next week salvaging what they could, replanting where possible, reinforcing the structures that had been damaged. It was exhausting, backbreaking work, and by the end of it, Elena felt like she'd aged 10 years. But they survived. They always survived. September came, and with it, the first hints of autumn. The air turned cooler, the leaves beginning to change. Elena looked at the hollow and saw how much it had transformed since she'd first stumbled into it nearly a year ago. The cabin was bigger, sturdier. The garden, despite the storm, was still producing. The barn and coops stood solid. This place had become something real, something lasting, and so had she. One night, as she lay in bed with the children asleep beside her, Elena made a decision. She didn't know if it was the right one, didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wasn't the same woman who'd walked into this hollow with nothing but grief and desperation. She was stronger now, harder, and she wasn't running anymore. Whatever came next, she'd face it here. The riders came back on the first day of October. Elena was inside mending one of Mary's dresses when she heard the horses. Her hands froze mid-stitch, the needle hanging in the air. She looked toward the window and saw them cresting the ridge. 4 men this time, not 3, riding in a tight formation that looked deliberate. Rowan was outside splitting wood. She watched him set down the axe and move toward the cabin, his stride measured, his face giving nothing away. He came through the door and closed it behind him. "Take the children to the back room," he said quietly. Elena didn't argue. She scooped up Samuel from where he was playing on the floor and grabbed Mary's hand. "Come on, sweetheart, we're going to play a quiet game." "What kind of game?" "The kind where we don't make any noise at all." Mary's eyes went wide, but she followed without complaint. Elena settled them in the back room, Samuel in her arms, Mary pressed against her side. Through the thin wall, she could hear hoofbeats growing louder, then stopping. A voice called out, rough and authoritative. "Rowan Hale, we need to talk." Rowan opened the door but didn't step outside. "About what?" "About the woman you're harboring, Elena Cross." Elena's breath caught. She tightened her grip on Samuel, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Don't know anyone by that name," Rowan said. "That's funny, because a man at the trading post said he saw her with you. Said she was alive and well, traveling with 2 children and a man matching your description." Man was mistaken. "I don't think he was." There was a pause, heavy with tension. Then another voice spoke, younger than the first, and Elena recognized it immediately. "Jacob Pruitt. Rowan, listen to me. We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to talk to Elena. There's things she needs to know, things that affect her and her children." "She doesn't want to talk to you," Rowan said flatly. "How do you know that if she's not here?" Rowan didn't answer. The first voice spoke again, harder this time. "We can do this easy or we can do it hard. Your choice." Elena heard Rowan shift, heard the creak of leather as he moved his hand toward his belt. She stood quickly, her heart pounding, and handed Samuel to Mary. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." Mary's face crumpled, fear bright in her eyes. "Mama, I'll be right back, I promise." Elena stepped into the main room and moved to the door. Rowan glanced at her, his jaw tight. "Don't," he said quietly. "I have to." She stepped past him and out into the clearing. The 4 men sat on their horses, watching her. 3 of them she didn't recognize, hard-faced men with rifles slung across their saddles. But Jacob she knew, and the look on his face was equal parts relief and apprehension. "Elena," he said, "thank you for coming out." "I didn't do it for you," she said coldly. "I did it so you'd leave." The man in front, the one who'd spoken first, leaned forward in his saddle. He was older, maybe 50, with gray streaking his beard and a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "My name's Henry Galt. I'm the territorial marshal. You know why I'm here?" "Jacob told me last time. My husband was innocent. Someone else was guilty. It's all very tragic." Elena's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I don't care." Galt's eyebrows rose. "You don't care that your husband's name has been cleared? His name doesn't bring him back." "No, but it does mean you're entitled to restitution. The land your husband owned, the property that was seized, it's yours again. The territorial governor has authorized compensation for your suffering, $500, free and clear." Elena stared at him. $500. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Enough to start over somewhere, to give her children a real future. But the thought of taking it, of accepting anything from the people who'd killed Thomas, made her stomach turn. "I don't want it," she said. Galt frowned. "You don't want $500? I don't want anything from you, or the town, or the governor. You took my husband. You cast me out. You left me to die, and now you want to throw money at me and call it even?" "Mrs. Cross, I understand you're angry." "You don't understand anything." Elena's voice rose, sharp and bitter. "You weren't there when they put the rope around his neck. You didn't watch him die for something he didn't do. You didn't walk out into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on your back and a child who stopped talking because of what she saw." Galt shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to offer you what's rightfully yours. If you don't want the money, fine. But the land is still yours. You have a legal claim to it." "I don't want the land either." "Then what do you want?" Elena looked at him, then at Jacob, then at the other 2 men. "I want you to leave. I want you to go back to wherever you came from and forget you ever found me." Jacob dismounted and took a step toward her. "Elena, please, just listen." Rowan moved between them, his hand on the knife at his belt. "She said leave." Jacob stopped, his hands raised. "I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm trying to help." "She doesn't need your help," Rowan said. Galt sighed, a long, weary sound. "Mrs. Cross, there's one more thing you should know. Walter Finch, the man who framed your husband, he's set to hang in 2 weeks. The trial's already done. But the judge wanted to give you the opportunity to be there, to see justice done." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. Walter Finch hanging. The man who'd destroyed her life, finally paying for it. Part of her wanted to see it, wanted to watch him die the way Thomas had died. but the thought of going back to that town, of standing in that square again, made her feel sick. "No," she said quietly. "No? I'm not going back. Not for him, not for the money, not for anything." Galt studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "All right. If that's your decision, I'll respect it. But I need you to sign some papers, legal documents saying you're declining the restitution and waiving your claim to the land. Otherwise, this stays open indefinitely." Elena hesitated. She didn't trust him, didn't trust any of them. But if signing papers meant they'd leave and never come back, it was worth it. "Fine," she said. "Where do I sign?" Galt reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather folder. He dismounted and spread the papers on a flat rock, pulling out a pen and ink. "Here, and here." Elena read the documents quickly. They were dense with legal language she didn't fully understand, but the gist was clear enough. She was giving up any claim to Thomas's land and property, declining the compensation, and agreeing not to pursue any further legal action against the town or territory. She signed where he indicated, her hand shaking slightly. Galt blotted the ink, folded the papers, and tucked them back into his saddlebag. "That's it then. You're free and clear." "I was always free," Elena said. "You just didn't know it." Galt mounted his horse and tipped his hat to her. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Cross, I'm sorry for what happened to you. It wasn't right." "No, it wasn't." He turned his horse and rode toward the ridge, the other two men following. Jacob lingered, his expression torn. "Elena, go, Jacob. I just want you to know, if you ever change your mind, I won't." Jacob looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He just nodded and mounted his horse, following the others up the trail. Elena stood in the clearing, watching until they disappeared over the ridge, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into nothing. Rowan came up beside her, his presence solid and steady. "You all right?" Elena shook her head. "No, but I will be." They stood together in silence, the wind rustling through the trees. Then Elena turned and went back inside where her children were waiting. Mary threw herself at Elena the moment she came through the door, wrapping her arms around her mother's legs. "You came back!" "Of course I did," Elena said, lifting the girl and holding her close. "I promised, didn't I?" Samuel was crying in the back room, his wails sharp and insistent. Elena carried Mary over and picked him up, balancing both children against her chest. They were heavy and warm and alive, and for a moment Elena couldn't breathe past the weight of everything she'd almost lost. That night, after the children were asleep, Elena sat at the table and stared at her hands. They were rough and scarred, the nails broken, the skin calloused from months of hard work. They didn't look like her hands anymore. They looked like someone else's. Rowan sat across from her, silent as always, waiting. "I turned down $500 today," Elena said finally. "I know. That's more money than I'll probably ever see again." "Probably. You think I'm stupid." "I think you're stubborn." Elena laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Yeah, that's one word for it." Rowan leaned back in his chair, his eyes on her. "Why'd you do it?" Elena thought about that. Thought about the town, the trial, the way they'd all turned their backs on her when she needed them most. Thought about Thomas's face as they'd led him to the gallows, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "Because taking their money would mean forgiving them," she said quietly. "And I'm not ready to do that. Maybe I never will be." Rowan nodded. "Fair enough." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Then Elena spoke again. "Do you ever regret it? Letting me stay?" Rowan looked at her, his expression serious. "No." "Not even a little?" "Not even a little." Elena felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Why?" Rowan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "I told you I had a wife and daughter. What I didn't tell you was how long I spent blaming myself after they died, thinking if I'd just done something different, been faster, been smarter, they'd still be here." Elena's throat tightened. "It wasn't your fault. I know that now. Took me years to know it, but I do. And somewhere along the way, I realized I had a choice. I could keep living like a ghost, hiding out here and waiting to die. Or I could try to be something other than the man who lost everything. And then I showed up. And then you showed up. Rowan's mouth quirked into something that might have been a smile. Half dead, bleeding all over my floor, stubborn enough to walk into a stranger's cabin with nothing but a prayer and a bad attitude. Elena smiled despite herself. Sounds about right. You gave me a reason to stop hiding, Rowan said. So no, I don't regret it. Elena looked at him across the table. This quiet, steady man who'd taken her in when he had no reason to, who delivered her child and built her a room, and never once asked for anything in return. She didn't know what she felt for him, didn't know if it was gratitude or trust or something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. But she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't leaving. The weeks after the Marshalls' visit were strange. Elena kept expecting them to come back, kept waiting for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal another intrusion. But the days passed quietly, the hollow undisturbed except for the normal rhythms of work and weather. October brought cooler temperatures and the first hard frost. The last of the garden was harvested and stored in the root cellar. Rowan hunted aggressively, bringing back deer and elk, and they smoked and salted the meat until the barn was full. Elena made candles from rendered fat, sewed winter clothes from the fabric they'd bought at the trading post, patched every hole and tear she could find. Mary turned into a little shadow, following Rowan everywhere he went, asking endless questions about everything he did. He tolerated it with more patience than Elena would have expected, teaching her to set snares, to identify animal tracks, to stack wood so it wouldn't topple. Samuel was 9 months old, crawling everywhere, pulling himself up on furniture and taking tentative steps before falling on his backside. He was loud and demanding and fearless, just like his sister. One afternoon in late October, Elena was washing dishes when Mary came running inside, her face flushed with excitement. "Mama, Mama, come see." Elena dried her hands and followed the girl outside. Rowan was standing near the tree line, and when Elena got closer, she saw what Mary was so excited about. A deer. A massive buck with a full rack of antlers, standing not 20 feet away, watching them with dark liquid eyes. "Don't move," Rowan said quietly. They all stood frozen, barely breathing. The buck tilted its head, studying them, then turned and walked slowly back into the trees. Mary let out a breath. "Did you see it?" "I saw it," Elena said, her heart still pounding. "Why didn't you shoot it?" Mary asked Rowan. "Didn't need to. We've got enough meat." "But it was right there." "I know, but sometimes you let things be." Mary thought about that, then nodded seriously. "Okay." Elena watched Rowan as he turned and headed back toward the woodpile, and she felt something shift inside her. This man who'd spent years alone, who'd lost everything and built walls so high nothing could get through, he was letting them in. Not just tolerating them, but choosing them, choosing this. And Elena was choosing it too. November came with snow. Not as brutal as the year before, but steady, persistent, covering the hollow in white. They settled into winter routines, keeping the fire burning, checking the animals, rationing supplies. The days were short and the nights were long, and they spent the evenings by the fire, Rowan carving, Elena sewing, the children playing quietly. One night, Mary climbed into Elena's lap and asked, "Where's Papa?" Elena's hand stilled on the fabric she was mending. She'd known this question would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier. "Papa's gone, sweetheart," she said carefully. "Where did he go?" Elena looked at Rowan, who was watching them from across the fire. He gave her a small nod, as if to say she could handle this however she needed to. "He had to leave," Elena said, "and he can't come back." "Why not?" "Because sometimes people leave and they don't get to come back. But he loved you very much. He loved both of us." Mary was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said, "Is Rowan going to leave too?" Rowan set down the piece of wood he was carving and looked at Mary. "No." "Promise?" "Promise." Mary nodded, satisfied, and curled back into Elena's arms. Elena met Rowan's eyes across the fire, and something passed between them, silent and certain. They were a family now. Not the one Elena had planned, not the one she'd imagined when she married Thomas, but a family all the same. Winter deepened. December was cold but manageable. They had enough food, enough firewood, enough of everything they needed to survive. Elena taught Mary her letters using a slate and chalk Rowan had traded for. Samuel took his first real steps on Christmas Eve, wobbling across the cabin floor into Elena's waiting arms. January was harder. A blizzard rolled through, trapping them inside for days. The wind howled and the snow piled so high they couldn't open the door. They burned through wood faster than Elena liked, and she worried about running out. But Rowan had prepared well, and they made it through. In February, Elena woke one morning to find the cabin colder than usual. She got up and checked the fire, adding more wood, but the chill didn't ease. She went to the window and looked out, and her breath caught. The snow had melted overnight. Not just a little, all of it. The clearing was bare, the ground dark and wet. Water dripped from the roof, from the trees, from everything. Rowan came up beside her, his expression puzzled. "That's not right." "What do you mean?" "It's too early. We've got another month of winter at least." But the snow didn't come back. The temperatures stayed mild, almost warm. Within a week, the first shoots of green appeared in the clearing. The creek swelled with runoff. Birds returned, their calls echoing through the hollow. Elena didn't trust it. Didn't trust the early spring, the sudden warmth. It felt wrong, like the land was playing a trick on them. But Rowan took advantage of it. He started clearing more land, expanding the garden space. Elena planted early crops, peas, lettuce, radishes, things that could handle a late frost if it came. The children thrived in the warmth. Mary ran wild through the clearing, her energy boundless. Samuel toddled after her, laughing and babbling. Elena watched them and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. March brought the riders. Not the marshal this time. Not Jacob. These were different men, 5 of them, armed and hard-eyed, riding into the clearing like they owned it. Rowan was in the barn when they arrived. Elena was outside with the children, hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between 2 trees. She saw them crest the ridge, and her blood went cold. She grabbed Mary and Samuel and ran for the cabin, slamming the door behind her. Through the window, she watched the men dismount, watched them spread out across the clearing. The leader, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes, walked toward the cabin door. Elena grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace and checked the chamber. It was loaded. She'd made sure of that after the last visit. A knock sounded, hard and deliberate. "Open up," the man called. "We're here on official business." Elena didn't move. "I said open up." The door rattled as he tried the latch. It held. Elena raised the rifle, her hands steady. Then she heard a voice from outside, calm and cold. Rowan's voice. "Step away from the door." The rattling stopped. Through the window, Elena saw Rowan standing near the barn, his rifle raised, aimed directly at the leader. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded. "I live here." "Who are you?" "Name's Dalton. I'm here representing the Coleridge Land Company. This property has been claimed under territorial ordinance for mineral rights development. You've got 24 hours to vacate." Elena's stomach dropped. Mineral rights. Land claim. They were trying to take the hollow. Rowan didn't lower the rifle. "This land's not for sale." "Didn't say it was for sale. Said it's been claimed. You got papers proving otherwise?" "I've got a rifle saying otherwise." Dalton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You really want to do this the hard way? I'm not doing it anyway. You're leaving. Now." Dalton's men shifted, hands moving toward their weapons. Elena's heart hammered in her chest. This was going to turn into a bloodbath, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Then a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and authoritative. "Nobody's drawing on anybody." Elena looked toward the ridge and saw him, Marshal Galt, riding down the trail with 2 deputies behind him. He rode straight into the clearing and positioned his horse between Rowan and Dalton. "Marshal," Dalton said, his tone carefully neutral, "this doesn't concern you. It does when you're about to start a war on land that's under territorial protection. This land's not protected. It's open claim. Not anymore." Galt pulled a folded document from his coat and handed it to Dalton. "Signed by the territorial governor 3 days ago. This hollow and everything in it is now protected homestead land, belonging to Elena Cross and her family. You try to take it, you're violating territorial law." Dalton unfolded the document and read it, his jaw tightening. "This is legal and binding," Galt said. "So I suggest you and your men get back on your horses and leave before I arrest you for trespassing." Dalton stared at him, fury barely contained. Then he shoved the document back at Galt and mounted his horse. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Galt said calmly. Dalton and his men rode out, their horses kicking up mud as they disappeared over the ridge. Galt waited until they were gone, then dismounted and walked toward the cabin. Elena opened the door, the rifle still in her hands. "Mrs. Cross," Galt said, tipping his hat. "What just happened?" she asked. "I made sure you wouldn't be bothered again. The governor owed me a favor, and I called it in. This land's yours now, legal and protected." Elena stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Galt glanced at Rowan, then back at her. "Because what happened to you and your husband was wrong. I can't fix it, but I can make sure you get to keep what you've built here." Elena didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long angry, so long convinced that everyone from her past was an enemy, that the gesture left her speechless. "Thank you," she finally managed. Galt nodded. "You take care of yourself, Mrs. Cross, and those children." He mounted his horse and rode out, his deputies following. Elena stood in the doorway, the rifle heavy in her hands, and watched him go. Rowan came up beside her, lowering his own rifle. "It's over." Elena looked at him, then at the hollow spreading out before them. The cabin, the barn, the garden, the land they'd worked so hard to make theirs. "Yeah," she said quietly. "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not really. Elena realized that standing in the doorway, watching the dust settle where the marshal's horse had been. The land was theirs now, legally, officially, protected by documents with official seals and signatures. But owning something on paper didn't make it yours, not in the way that mattered. She looked at Rowan, who was checking the rifle, making sure it was unloaded before putting it away. His face was calm, unreadable as always, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "Maybe. Not maybe. They will. Men like Dalton don't give up just because a piece of paper says they have to." Rowan looked at her, his eyes steady. "Then we'll be ready." Elena wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that being ready was enough, that preparation could stop what was coming. But she'd learned the hard way that sometimes the world didn't care how ready you were. She went back inside, closing the door behind her. Mary and Samuel were huddled together on the bed, Mary's arms wrapped protectively around her brother. Elena sat beside them and pulled them both close. "It's all right," she said, even though she wasn't sure it was. "Everything's all right." Mary looked up at her, her young face serious. "Are the bad men coming back?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Rowan won't let them hurt us." Elena's chest tightened, the faith in Mary's voice, the absolute certainty that Rowan would protect them. It was both beautiful and terrifying. Because what happened if he couldn't? What happened if being brave and prepared and ready wasn't enough? "No," Elena said quietly. "He won't." That night, after the children were asleep, Elena and Rowan sat at the table and talked. Really talked, in a way they hadn't since she'd first arrived. "Tell me about the land company," Elena said. "What do they want?" "Mineral rights. There's copper in these hills, maybe silver. They want to dig it out, sell it, make money. And they don't care who's in the way. They never do." Elena traced a pattern on the wooden table with her finger, thinking. "Galt said the land's protected. What does that actually mean?" "Means they can't legally force us off. But legal doesn't always stop people who want something bad enough. So what do we do?" Rowan leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the fire. "We stay. We defend what's ours. We don't give them a reason to come back, and if they do, we make it clear they're not welcome. And if that's not enough, then we make it enough." Elena had heard those words before, from Rowan, and they still didn't comfort her. But she understood what he was saying. They didn't have a choice. This was their home now, the only place either of them had left. Walking away wasn't an option. "I need to learn to shoot," Elena said suddenly. Rowan looked at her, surprised. "You know how to shoot." "I know how to hold a rifle. That's not the same as knowing how to use it." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we start tomorrow." They did. Every morning for the next 2 weeks, after the chores were done and the children were occupied, Rowan took Elena out to a clearing beyond the ridge and taught her to shoot. He set up targets, chunks of wood, old bottles, anything that would show when she hit it, and had her practice until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. At first she was terrible. Her aim was off, her grip too tight, her breathing unsteady. But Rowan was patient, adjusting her stance, correcting her form, making her do it again and again until muscle memory took over. "Don't think about it," he said one afternoon, standing behind her as she lined up a shot. "Just breathe and let it happen." Elena exhaled slowly and pulled the trigger. The bottle exploded, glass scattering across the ground. "There," Rowan said. "That's it." Elena lowered the rifle, her hand shaking slightly, and smiled. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. She wasn't helpless anymore. She wasn't the woman who'd stumbled into this hollow with nothing but desperation and grief. She was someone who could fight back. Spring turned into summer. The garden grew thick and green, the vegetables coming in faster than they could eat them. Elena preserved everything: pickled cucumbers, canned beans, dried herbs. The root cellar filled up, jar by jar, a stockpile against the winter and whatever else might come. Mary turned 4 in June. She was taller now, her face losing some of its baby roundness, her vocabulary expanding daily. She helped with everything: feeding the chickens, weeding the garden, watching Samuel when Elena and Rowan were busy. She was smart and stubborn and fearless, and Elena didn't know whether to be proud or terrified. Samuel was walking now, toddling around the clearing on unsteady legs, getting into everything. He was loud and messy and demanding, but he was healthy and happy, and that was all Elena could ask for. Rowan built a second coop and traded for more chickens at the post. He expanded the barn, adding stalls for goats. He said they'd need come winter. He reinforced the fence around the property, making it harder for anyone to approach unseen. He was preparing for something, and Elena didn't ask what because she already knew. In July, travelers started appearing. Not many, just a few at first. People heading west, looking for land, looking for opportunity. They'd stop at the hollow asking for water or directions, and Rowan would give it to them, but he never invited them to stay. Elena watched these encounters carefully, noting the way Rowan sized people up, the way he kept himself between the strangers and the cabin. One evening, a family stopped. A man and woman with 3 children, their wagon loaded with everything they owned. The man was polite, tired, his face weathered from too many days on the road. "We're heading for the valley settlements," he said. "Heard there's good land there, cheap." "There is," Rowan said. "Another 2 days west." The man nodded, then glanced at Elena, who was standing in the doorway with Samuel on her hip. "You folks been here long?" "Long enough," Elena said. "It's good land," the man said, looking around the clearing. "Must have taken some work to get it like this." It did. The man's wife stepped forward, a baby in her arms, her face pale and exhausted. "Would you have any milk to spare? Our cow died 3 days back, and the baby—" Elena didn't let her finish. "Wait here." She went inside and came back with a jar of goat's milk and a small sack of dried beans. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Elena nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You should keep moving. There's weather coming." The family left, the man tipping his hat, the woman clutching the milk like it was gold. Elena watched them go and felt something twist in her chest. That could have been her, a year ago. That could have been her children, hungry and desperate on the side of some trail. Rowan came up beside her. "You gave them the last of the milk. We'll get more." "That's not the point." Elena turned to look at him. "Then what is?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've got a soft heart. That's going to get you hurt one of these days." "Maybe, but I'd rather have a soft heart than a hard one." Rowan didn't argue. He just nodded and went back to his work. August brought the heat, the kind of oppressive, suffocating heat that made everything harder. The garden wilted despite daily watering. The chickens stopped laying. Even the children were sluggish, moving slowly through the day, complaining about the temperature. Elena missed the cabin's coolness, but the heat drove them outside in the evenings, sitting under the trees where there was at least a breeze. Rowan would carve while the children played, and Elena would sew or mend or just sit and watch the sunset behind the ridge. One night, Mary asked a question that caught Elena off guard. "Mama, are you and Rowan married?" Elena's hand stilled on the fabric she was working on. "No, sweetheart, we're not." "Why not?" Elena glanced at Rowan, who was suddenly very focused on the piece of wood in his hands. Because being married is more than just living together. It's a choice people make. Don't you like Rowan? I do, very much. Then why don't you marry him? Elena didn't know how to answer that. The truth was complicated, tangled up in grief and guilt and feelings she didn't know how to name. She'd loved Thomas, loved him deeply, and part of her felt like loving someone else would be a betrayal. But another part of her, a part that was growing louder every day, knew that what she felt for Rowan was real, even if it was different. Marriage is complicated, she said finally. Someday when you're older, you'll understand. Mary didn't look satisfied with that answer, but she didn't push. She just went back to playing with Samuel, building towers of stones that the baby immediately knocked down. Later, after the children were asleep, Elena sat outside alone, staring at the stars. She heard the cabin door open and close, heard Rowan's footsteps approaching. He sat down beside her without a word. Sorry about earlier, Elena said. Mary's questions. Don't apologize, she's a kid. Kids ask questions. Still, it was awkward. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Would you, if I asked? Elena's breath caught. Would I what? Marry me. She turned to look at him, searching his face in the dim starlight. He wasn't smiling, wasn't nervous. He just looked at her with the same steady calm he brought to everything. Are you asking? She said quietly. I don't know. Maybe. Elena felt something crack open inside her, something she'd been holding closed for too long. I loved my husband, Rowan. I loved him so much it nearly killed me when he died. I know. And I don't know if I can love someone like that again. I don't know if I have it in me. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Rowan reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and rough. I'm asking if you want to build something with me. Not just this place, but a life. A real one. For you, for me, for the kids. I'm not asking you to forget Thomas or pretend he didn't exist. I'm just asking if you want to keep going forward instead of looking back. Elena felt tears sting her eyes. She'd spent so long looking back, clinging to what she'd lost, that she'd almost forgotten how to look forward. But sitting here with Rowan, his hand in hers, she realized something. She didn't have to choose between honoring Thomas's memory and building a future with Rowan. She could do both. Yes, she said quietly. I want that. Rowan squeezed her hand, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. They didn't get married right away. There was no preacher in the hollow, no official to perform the ceremony. But one evening in late September, as the leaves started to turn and the air grew cool, they made their own vows. Standing in the clearing with the children watching, they spoke promises to each other, to stay, to protect, to build something together that would last. It wasn't legal or official or recognized by any authority, but it was real. And that was enough. October came, and with it the anniversary of Elena's arrival at the hollow. She stood in the clearing one morning, looking around at everything they'd built. The cabin with its new room, the barn and coops, the garden, harvested and cleared for winter, the land they'd fought for and earned. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, broken, desperate, half dead from cold and grief. And she thought about the woman she was now, strong, capable, rooted. The transformation hadn't been easy. There'd been pain and fear and moments when she'd thought she couldn't keep going. But she had. And in the process, she'd learned something important. Home wasn't something you were given. It was something you built piece by piece, choice by choice. It was work and sweat and refusing to give up even when everything told you to quit. It was waking up every morning and deciding to stay, to fight, to make something out of nothing. And it was people. The ones who stayed beside you when everyone else walked away. The ones who saw you at your worst and didn't flinch. The ones who helped you carry what you couldn't carry alone. That night, Elena stood outside and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Rowan came up beside her and she leaned into him, feeling his arm settle around her shoulders. You ever think about leaving? She asked. No. Not even a little? Not even a little. Elena smiled. Me neither. November brought the first snow, light and powdery, covering the hollow in white. The children played in it, building lopsided snowmen and throwing snowballs, their laughter echoing through the trees. Elena watched from the doorway, Samuel bundled in her arms, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was called. Peace. The winter was mild compared to the first one. They had plenty of food, plenty of wood, plenty of everything they needed. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Chores in the morning, lessons for Mary in the afternoon, evenings by the fire. Samuel took his first steps in December, walking from Elena to Rowan with a determined expression that made them both laugh. Christmas came and they celebrated quietly. Rowan carved toys for the children, a horse for Mary, a set of blocks for Samuel. Elena made a small cake from precious sugar and dried berries, and they ate it together, savoring every bite. Mary looked up at Rowan with frosting on her nose and said, "Papa, can I have more?" Elena's breath caught. She looked at Rowan, who'd gone very still. "What did you call me?" he asked quietly. Mary blinked, suddenly uncertain. "Papa, is that okay?" Rowan's throat worked, and for a moment Elena thought he might cry, but he just nodded and reached over to wipe the frosting from her nose. "Yeah, sweetheart, that's okay." Mary beamed and went back to her cake. Elena met Rowan's eyes across the table, and the look they shared said everything that words couldn't. January brought a visitor. Elena was inside mending clothes when she heard hoofbeats. Her stomach clenched, her mind immediately going to Dalton and his men. But when she looked out the window, she saw only one rider, a woman, middle-aged, dressed in practical traveling clothes. Rowan was already outside, his hand on the rifle. The woman dismounted and raised her hands, showing she was unarmed. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she called. "I'm looking for Elena Cross." Elena stepped outside, her heart pounding. "I'm Elena Cross." The woman looked her over, then smiled. "My name's Margaret Hayes. I run a women's cooperative in the Valley Settlement, about 3 days west of here. We help women who've lost their husbands or who are trying to start over. I heard about you from a family who passed through here last summer. They said you gave them milk and beans when they were desperate." Elena remembered the family, the exhausted mother with the baby. "I remember them. They told everyone they met about you, said if they'd had neighbors like you back east, they might never have left. Word got around, and I wanted to come see for myself if the stories were true." Elena didn't know what to say. "What stories?" "That there's a woman out here who survived hell and built herself a home anyway. A woman who helps people even when she's got nothing to spare. A woman who doesn't back down." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not anybody special. That's where you're wrong." Margaret stepped forward, her expression serious. "Women like you are rare, Elena. Women who've been broken and put themselves back together. Women who know what it's like to have nothing and claw their way back to something. Those are the women we need in this territory. The ones who won't quit." Elena looked at Rowan, who was watching the exchange with quiet interest. Then she looked back at Margaret. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know you're not alone. There are other women out here, women who've survived what you've survived. And if you ever need help, or if you ever want to help others, we're there. The cooperative isn't far. You're welcome anytime." Elena felt something loosen in her chest. Something she hadn't realized was clenched tight. She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone, not really. There were others like her, women who'd been cast out and counted as dead but had refused to die. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Margaret nodded and mounted her horse. "Take care of yourself, Elena. And that family of yours." She rode out, disappearing over the ridge. Elena stood in the clearing, watching the empty trail, and felt a shift inside her. She'd spent so long thinking of herself as separate, isolated, cut off from the world. But she wasn't. She was part of something bigger, a community of survivors, of fighters, of women who refused to break. February brought a thaw, the snow melting early just like the year before. Rowan took advantage of it, starting work on a new project, a small schoolhouse for Mary. He built it near the cabin, just big enough for a desk and a few shelves for books. "We need to get her some proper schooling," he said one evening, sawing boards. "She's too smart to waste." Elena smiled. "You think you can find books out here?" "I can try." He did. At the trading post in March, he came back with a primer, a slate, and a handful of books, simple stories, basic arithmetic, geography. Mary dove into them with an enthusiasm that made Elena's chest ache. Her daughter was smart, curious, hungry for knowledge. She deserved more than this remote hollow could offer, but Elena would make sure she got everything she could give. Samuel was talking now, short sentences that got longer every day. He followed Mary everywhere, mimicking her, trying to do everything she did. He was stubborn and headstrong, and Elena saw so much of Thomas in him it hurt. But it was a good hurt, a reminder that Thomas wasn't really gone. He lived on in their son, in the way Samuel laughed and the way he refused to give up when something was hard. April brought wildflowers, carpeting the clearing in yellow and purple. Elena planted the garden again, expanding it, adding new crops, corn, potatoes, carrots. They had the land now, legally protected, and she was going to use every inch of it. One afternoon, Rowan came back from checking the traps and said, "Found something you should see." Elena followed him into the woods, Mary and Samuel trailing behind. He led them to a clearing she'd never noticed before, tucked away in a fold of the hills. In its center was a grave, old, weathered, marked with a simple wooden cross. "My wife and daughter," Rowan said quietly. "I buried them here." Elena's throat tightened. What were their names? Anne and Lily. Elena knelt beside the grave, her hand on the weathered wood. "I'm sorry, Rowan. I'm so sorry." He knelt beside her. "I come here sometimes, to talk to them, to tell them what's happening. I know it sounds foolish. It doesn't. I told them about you, about the kids, about what we're building." He paused, his voice rough. "I think they'd be glad, that I'm not alone anymore." Elena took his hand. "I think they would too." They sat there for a while, the four of them, in silence. Then Mary spoke up, her voice small. "Can we bring flowers?" "Yes, sweetheart," Elena said. "We can bring flowers." They did, every few weeks after that. Mary would pick wildflowers and arrange them carefully by the grave, and Samuel would sit quietly, not understanding but knowing this was important. Elena would say a silent prayer, not to anyone in particular, just a hope sent out into the universe that Anne and Lily knew they weren't forgotten. May brought news. A rider came through, a young man heading east, carrying messages for the territorial government. He stopped at the hollow for water and told them that the Coal Ridge Land Company had gone under, bankrupt, shut down, all their claims invalidated. "What happened?" Elena asked. "Turns out they'd been cooking the books, claiming mineral rights they didn't have. The governor investigated and found fraud all the way up. Seized their assets, disbanded the company. Anyone they'd tried to force off their land is protected now." Elena looked at Rowan, and she saw the same relief she felt reflected in his eyes. It was really over. The threat was gone, not just delayed, but eliminated. "Thank you," she said to the rider, "for telling us." He tipped his hat and rode on, and Elena stood in the clearing and let herself breathe. They were safe. Finally, truly safe. Summer came in full and beautiful, the kind of summer that made everything else worth it. The garden exploded with growth, the chickens laid prolifically, the goats gave milk. The children grew brown and wild, running through the clearing from dawn to dusk, their laughter constant. Elena and Rowan worked side by side, expanding the homestead, building for the future. They talked about getting a cow, maybe some pigs, about building a larger barn, about someday, maybe, helping other families settle nearby, creating a real community. One evening in August, as the sun set and the air turned cool, Elena stood in the clearing and looked around at everything they'd built. The cabin, solid and sturdy. The garden, lush and green. The children, healthy and happy. The man beside her, steady and strong. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived, broken, desperate, more dead than alive. And she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the choices she'd made, the things she'd lost and the things she'd found. She'd learned something in this hollow, something she wished she could tell every woman who'd ever been told she was worthless, every person who'd ever been cast aside and left to die. You don't need permission to rebuild yourself. You don't need anyone's approval to claim your life back. The world will try to break you, will tell you you're done, that there's nothing left for you. But you get to decide if that's true. You get to decide if you're finished or if you're just getting started. Elena had chosen to start, and in starting, she'd found something she'd thought was lost forever. She'd found home. Rowan came up beside her, sliding his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Elena leaned into him, watching their children play in the fading light. I'm thinking about how far we've come. We've come a long way. And how far we still have to go. Rowan smiled. That too. Elena looked up at him, this quiet man who'd saved her life without ever asking for anything in return, who'd given her children a father and given her a partner and given her a reason to keep fighting. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For not turning me away, for letting me stay, for building this with me. Rowan's arm tightened around her. I didn't let you stay. You chose to. There's a difference. Elena thought about that. He was right. She'd chosen to stay, just like she'd chosen to fight, chosen to survive, chosen to build something from nothing. Every step of this journey had been a choice, and she'd made every one of them herself. That was the real truth, the one that mattered. She hadn't been saved, she'd saved herself. And in the process, she'd learned that the only person who could give her life meaning was her. Not the town that cast her out. Not the husband she'd lost. Not even the man standing beside her now. Just her, making choices, building a life one day at a time. The sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in shades of fire. Mary called out, asking if she could stay up to see the stars. Samuel ran to Elena, wrapping his small arms around her legs. Yes, sweetheart, Elena called back. You can stay up. They sat together in the clearing as darkness fell, the four of them watching the stars appear one by one. Elena held Samuel in her lap, Rowan's arm around her shoulders, Mary leaning against her side. This was her family. Not the one she'd planned, not the one she'd imagined in those early days with Thomas, but it was hers, built from scratch, forged in hardship, stronger for everything they'd survived. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Elena looked up at the stars, at the vast, endless sky, and felt something settle deep in her bones. Peace, certainty, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wasn't running anymore, wasn't hiding, wasn't surviving day to day, waiting for the next blow to fall. She was living, fully, completely, without apology or fear. And for the first time since Thomas died, Elena Cross was home. Autumn arrived right on schedule, painting the hollow in gold and red. The harvest was bigger than ever, enough to fill the root cellar and trade some at the post. They stored meat, canned vegetables, made preserves from wild berries. Winter was coming, but they were ready, more than ready. They were thriving. Mary started reading on her own, devouring every book Rowan could find. Samuel learned his letters, tracing them in the dirt with a stick. The children were growing, changing, becoming people in their own right. And Elena watched them with a fierce pride that sometimes overwhelmed her. These were her children, her family, her life. And it was a damn good one. On the first day of November, exactly 2 years after Elena had stumbled into the hollow half dead and desperate, she stood in the clearing and looked around. Everything was different. The land, the cabin, the people. Her. She'd arrived here with nothing but grief and 2 children she didn't know how to feed. And now she had a home, a partner, a future. She'd arrived broken and alone. And now she was whole and surrounded by people who loved her. The journey hadn't been easy. There'd been pain and loss and moments when giving up seemed like the only option. But she'd kept going. And in the going, she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Herself. The real Elena Cross. Not the woman Thomas's wife had been, or the woman the town had cast out, but the woman she'd chosen to become. Strong, capable, fierce, gentle, flawed, human. That woman was enough. She'd always been enough. Rowan came up beside her and they stood together in silence, watching the sun set over their land. You ever regret it? Elena asked. Staying here instead of going back? No, Rowan said simply. This is where I belong. Elena nodded. Yeah, me too. And she meant it. With every fiber of her being, she meant it. This hollow, this life, this family, it was hers. She'd claimed it, built it, earned it, and no one could ever take it away. The stars came out bright and clear in the cold November sky. Elena breathed in the crisp air and let herself feel it all. The gratitude, the peace, the hard-won joy. She'd survived hell. She'd walked through fire and come out the other side. And she was done running, done hiding, done apologizing for taking up space in a world that had tried to erase her. Elena Cross was home, and she was staying, for good.